So, Aviva, why are so many women suffering with conditions that our cave grandmothers never experienced and didn't plague them?
Yeah, so our cave grandmothers did not have 80,000 environmental chemicals, which we are literally exposed to every day, some of those. In fact, it's really astonishing. Since its inception in 1974, the EPA has banned 200 chemicals ever. So we have this constellation of environmental exposures, genetic predispositions, but also the things our grandmothers did. You ever seen Mad Men, an episode of Mad Men?
I've seen it once or twice.
Yeah, I have too. And the pregnant women have a cigarette and a scotch, right? This was our grandmothers and great-grandmothers, depending on how old you are.
Right.
So we've got the cigarette and the scotch. We've got 80,000 environmental chemicals. By the time we are 20 years old, the average kid in the United States has had 18 to 20 antibiotic exposures.
Wow.
Then by the time we're 20 and 30 years old, we've had another 10. So you start to add these insults onto our systems, and then on top of that, you add depletion. So we have this overload of environmental exposures, and then we have a lot of depletion. So the World Health Organization did a study some years ago looking at nutrition amongst people in the United States, and something like 70% of us, for example, were deficient in magnesium. The Centers for Disease Control does studies every couple of years looking at nutrition in the US, and women continually come up low in iodine, zinc, magnesium, essential fatty acids, and the list goes on. So much like we talk about being overfed and undernourished with kind of the sad standard American diet, many of our systems, our detoxification systems, our digestive systems, our immune systems, are overfed and undernourished. And the immune system is kind of the body's way of speaking to us and saying, hey, I'm in a crisis. And it's interesting, a lot of immune disease or autoimmune disease particularly, gets us to kind of slow down.
Yep.
It kind of brings us to our knees and makes us start to take a look at what's going on in our health. So it's a really interesting time where and it's not just autoimmune disease that's escalating. We've seen tripling of rates of asthma, allergies, eczema, food allergies, even in kids.
So then you also have this stress epidemic.
Exactly.
And it affects men and women, but it seems like particularly so women, with 50% of women unable to turn it off and go to sleep at night. And why is that?
You know, it's funny, when I first started reading the statistics from the American Psychological Association, the American Sleep Association on women and stress, my first assumption was either somebody thinks that women complain more about our stress, like we talk about it more, but actually, when you start to actually dial down the science behind it, women are having way more physical symptoms due to stress than male counterparts. So there have been studies looking at, for example, the studies have only been done in male-female couples and heterosexual couples, but for example, if I were to sleep next to a male partner that I was unhappy next to, my cortisol would go up and my sleep would be disrupted, and that kind of sets everything off.
Right.
Men don't have that. They can sleep next to, I guess, anybody. No offense, guys. No offense, but their cortisol doesn't go up. Similarly, if I were to come home from work and download my crappy day on my male partner, his cortisol doesn't go up. My male partner comes home and downloads his sad, hard day on me, and my cortisol goes up. There's something happening with our connectivity and our empathy, and that may dial back also to some things like how our cortisol responds or how our oxytocin does or doesn't buffer our stress response. Then on top of it, you add women are dealing with a lot of life cycle changes that men don't. So they don't get their period every month, right? They're not having a moon time.
Right.
They're not going through the hormonal experience of having kids or the sleeping with one eye open, right? Like most men in male-female partners can sleep through a baby waking up at night, right? Oh, the baby slept great last night, honey. Like, actually, no, I was up 16 times. This is very typical. Also, women in our culture, we tend to be the caregivers. So a lot of my patients are women in their early 40s, for example. Well, I see women of all ages, but they're having their first kid is 6 years old. So they're at an age where they're having young kids, but also elderly parents they're taking care of. And statistically, even women who have outside of the home jobs, even if the partner is a stay-at-home parent, it's still typically the woman who's shopping for the groceries on the way home.
So all part of that invisible workload.
Yeah, it's invisible work.
So much
and
about.
Then there's even so much more invisible work, Colleen, which is, there's a quote by Erica Zhang where she says, women are our own worst self-sabotagers, and our biggest weapon is guilt. So we experience a lot of guilt. I know it's powerful. It just gives
That
me chills,
resonates.
right? Yes. And so we experience a lot of guilt. We're really hard on ourselves. When I think about autoimmune disease, I mean, what is happening? It's the body attacking itself.
So let's talk a little bit more about autoimmune disease, because
Yeah.
it does seem like there's an epidemic right now.
There is.
Conservatively, 24 million people.
Yes.
And it wasn't something that we were talking about in the same way that we are now 5 or 10 years ago. So
isn't.
what is going on?
So it's escalating, and I think kind of like when we look at, the hurricanes that are happening right now, it's easy to say, oh, well, this is just a weird weather pattern, but we know that things like global warming, carbon emissions, they're contributing to weather patterns. When we look at the sort of escalation of what's happening environmentally, planetarily, but also our food, the hits on the microbiome, now 2-3 generations back from our grandmothers with the scotch and the cigarettes, we're reaching kind of a critical mass, or if you will, a perfect storm, where we're kind of in a place where the body is trying to keep up with the demands of the environment, but it can only keep up so far. I mean, we're so beautifully resilient. There's this quote I love, which is, what if I told you your body had the ability to heal beyond anything you've ever been led to believe? And we can, but we have to have the right elements, and we're being exposed to so many things that just are overloading us day in and day out, stress, toxins, et cetera.
So with all of these elements, between stress, autoimmune disease, we know that in some ways fertility is a proxy for health. Are you worried about the future of fertility with what is going on in the state of women's health right now?
It's interesting because female fertility rates, so about 1 in 8 women in her life will seek a fertility consultation. Or 1 in 8 of all women will seek a fertility. So it's pretty substantial how many women are experiencing fertility problems. That rate has actually stayed somewhat level over the past 10 years. What we're really interestingly seeing is male fertility problems going up. And, we have a lot of estrogen anyway. Women, we're driven by estrogen. So for us to become estrogen overloaded, we start to see it in problems like breast cancer, endometrial cancer, hormonal imbalances, but men are not meant to be exposed to the level of environmental estrogens that we're seeing. So we're even seeing newborn baby boys born with genital deformities that have to do with estrogen exposure. So I'm super concerned about women, but I'm really concerned that we're missing a lot of male fertility problems because of estrogen and environmental exposure. So yes,
I'm
I'm
talking
concerned
about them enough too.
We're not, and it's not just fertility, but it's even when you do get pregnant, we're seeing just this escalate. The Environmental Working Group did a study looking at the level of environmental toxins in newborn umbilical cord blood, and they found something like 284 toxins, and that study has now been repeated and corroborated many times. So it's fertility, but it's what the babies are being exposed to in utero, and a whole lifelong. There's this term emerging now called the exposome, and it's all of the factors that we're being exposed to. And babies are definitely getting hit hard, and pregnant moms too.
So we know that diet is such a huge piece of the problem and also the solution.
Yeah.
What diet advice specific to women would you give to someone who's struggling with stress, infertility, or an autoimmune disease?
So
Are there some ground rules that we can all...
there are some ground rules. Diet is so personal and food is so personal, and each different woman needs something different. But there are some things that I would definitely say across the board, and one is keeping our blood sugar steady, because when your blood sugar is plummeting all the time, and women are notoriously skipping
I shouldn't start the day with a donut.
Start the day with a donut, definitely, and then don't eat until at least 4, and then have another donut. Definitely. Make sure you get some coffee in there.
Got it.
So I did have one of those chocolate cherry scones, but with my eggs and my...
Good.
Yes, but which is really important, because I think we're restricting more and more and more. I have a lot of women coming in who are just either feel they're unable to eat a lot of foods, so they have become, I have patients coming in eating 3 foods, basically. There's a lot of confusion over carbs, and so a lot of women are skipping carbs.
Are carbs good or bad for women? Or
good carbs?
Okay.
Good carbs are good for most women. Sometimes women do need to peel back on them a little bit because they're getting too many or the wrong kind for their body. But study after study is now showing that, for example, getting a good healthy carb like a whole grain or a sweet potato or squash, if you can't eat a whole grain for some reason, about 3 to 5 hours before bed actually levels out your evening cortisol, keeps your weight healthier, and prevents you from having cravings the next day, which is really important.
So it sounds similar to the Mediterranean diet?
I'm big on the Mediterranean diet.
Okay.
So there really is no such thing as the Mediterranean diet. There's a Mediterranean style of eating. There really is. Nobody's ever codified the Mediterranean diet. It was a concept that Walter Willett at Harvard really started promoting and calling it that. But it's essentially, it's a whole foods, plant-based diet. It tends to be not restrictive. There is often a little dairy, some grain. I mean, everybody eats bread in the Mediterranean, but people tend to tolerate it better over there. There are lots of nuances. Some people do need to be gluten-free or do have celiac or gluten intolerance. But in general, it's a liberal diet with a lot of vegetables, good quality fats, nuts and seeds, good quality protein, and not skipping meals, really eating regularly for what works for your body. I would say the Mediterranean diet is kind of interesting in that what we call the Mediterranean diet is not how people eat in general in the Mediterranean now. It was actually a post-World War II, fairly limited subsistence diet that included legumes. It included a lot of foraged wild foods that tend to have more plant chemicals in them that do boost our immunity and act as antioxidants and supply nutrients, but also things like microRNA that we're getting from plants that are kind of stripped out of our modern day diet. So I'd say not restricting beyond what you really need for health. Definitely not letting your blood sugar get too low, because what tends to happen then, I talk about in my latest book this concept of SOS, survival overdrive syndrome. And one of the things that our bodies recognize as a very primitive emergency sign is low blood sugar. And so it sends you into basically DEFCON 4. And we all know what that feels like. We've skipped one too many meals and you're shaky and you can't think and you're hangry, right? You're gonna eat somebody or something. And what happens is you go for the quickest, fastest thing that's going to feed your brain. You go for sugar and a quick carb, and you get in this vicious cycle. So if we can keep that blood sugar steady, super important, and eat a lot of plants. You know, I think paleo has its place, but I see a lot of people coming in basically living on meat and fat, but we are skipping the vegetables. We really need like 8 to 10 servings of vegetables a day, and most of us aren't getting that. So thinking about plants at every meal, including breakfast, really powerful.
And what's the number one thing young women can do to take charge of their health today?
You know, I think it's actually believing that you can take charge of your health. I think it's Angela Davis or somebody who said the quickest way we lose our power is by not believing we have power. You know, with autoimmune disease, 80 to 90% of autoimmune disease sufferers are women. And as women, we have been taught to keep quiet, not question authority. And it can almost make me cry, the stories of women who have come in and been told year after year after year by their doctor that their fatigue, their brain fog, their depression, their anxiety, their aches and pains are depression, just stress, and they're getting medicated. 1 in 4 women is on an antidepressant, but approximately 30% of those women may have a thyroid disorder, on autoimmune thyroid disorder. It's just never been detected. So I really believe it's believing that you have the power to take control of your health and not being afraid to speak up for yourself. You kind of have to be a little bit of a health rebel. If you're afraid to speak up for yourself when you're in the doctor's office, bring someone with you who will give you that courage, bring a script. But believe that your body does have the capacity to heal, and don't believe it when somebody says you can't. And don't believe it if you know you have something that's not right, and somebody's saying you're just fine, or it's just stress. Maybe it is stress, but there's no such thing as just stress. Stress is not benign either. So yeah, I would say be a health rebel and believe you have the ability. And then really believe yourself as your own highest authority. There are a lot of us. There are a lot of health experts, if you haven't noticed. There's a lot of us in the internet space these days, and it can get really confusing. If something doesn't resonate with you, if it's not sitting right with you, if you try it and it doesn't feel right, even if somebody else says you should be doing that intermittent fast or that paleo diet or that Mediterranean diet, and if it's not feeling right to you, if it's not working for you, it's not right for you. And I think that we don't trust ourselves enough. We don't listen to our gut. We're all about the gut. We're not listening to our guts as women, and we really have to dial in and listen to our guts.
Well, I think that's a really important message to leave on. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.